Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Golden Child's Shadow. Julian Kane had always lived in the shadow of expectations that were never meant for him. At 30, he stood 6'2" with broad shoulders earned from years of construction work, his hands calloused from building other people's dreams while his own gathered dust. His dark hair was already showing streaks of premature gray, a testament to the stress of carrying a family that had never learned to carry itself. The Kane family business, Kane and Sons Construction, had been Julian's inheritance and his burden. His father, Herbert Kane, had built the company from nothing in the 1980s, turning it into one of the most respected construction firms in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. When Herbert died of a heart attack 3 years ago, Julian had stepped up without question, keeping the family business alive and profitable. But profit, Julian had learned, was a relative term when you had siblings like his. His sister Francine Kane Mansfield had married into money, or so she liked to pretend. Her husband, Taylor Mansfield, worked in financial consulting and spoke in the kind of corporate jargon that made simple concepts sound revolutionary. They lived in a sprawling suburban home with a 3-car garage and a golden retriever named Winston who, according to Francine, had better breeding than most people. His brother Sean, Kane, had taken a different path. At 28, he dropped out of college twice, failed at 3 different business ventures, and was currently finding himself through a series of get-rich-quick schemes and motivational seminars. Their mother, Paula Kane, enabled his every failure with a checkbook and unconditional support that Julian had never experienced. Julian's wife, Sophia Kane, had once been Sophia Charles, a real estate agent he'd met 4 years ago when he was contracting work on a development she was selling. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made men stop and stare. Auburn hair that caught the light just right, green eyes that seemed to promise secrets, and a smile that could disarm the most suspicious buyer. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, at least according to Sophia. But lately, that smile had been increasingly rare, and those green eyes held secrets Julian was beginning to suspect he didn't want to uncover. The first sign had been the late nights. Sophia claimed the real estate market was booming, requiring her to show houses at all hours. Then came the new wardrobe, designer clothes that seemed excessive for showing split-level ranches to young families. The final red flag was her sudden interest in fitness, joining an expensive gym across town when there was a perfectly good 5 minutes from their house. Julian wasn't naive. He'd grown up in a family where loyalty was conditional and love came with price tags. He'd learned to read people, to spot the tells that preceded betrayal. But knowing something and proving it were different things entirely. As he sat in his office at the construction site on a gray February morning, reviewing contract for the Morrison residential project, Julian's phone buzzed with a text for Francine. Family dinner Sunday. Mom's making pot roast. Be there by 5. Not an invitation, a command. Julian stared at the message, feeling the familiar weight of obligation settle on his shoulders. Every Sunday, the Kane family gathered at their mother's house on Maple Street, the same house where Julian had grown up feeling like a guest in his own home. He typed back, "I'll be there." What he didn't add was that this Sunday would be different. This Sunday, Julian had plans that extended far beyond pot roast and small talk. Plans that had been months in the making, waiting for the right moment to unfold. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. Sunday dinner at the Kane house was a ritual as predictable as it was exhausting. Paula Kane's dining room hadn't changed in 20 years. The same floral wallpaper, the same china cabinet filled with dishes that only came out for holidays, the same family photos that conspicuously featured fewer pictures of Julian as the years progressed. Julian arrived exactly at 5, bringing a bottle of wine that he knew wouldn't be appreciated but brought anyway out of habit. Sophia was already there, having driven separately, another recent development that she explained away with vague mentions of errands and timing. Julian, his mother's voice carried that particular tone of surprise she used when he actually showed up, as if his presence was unexpected despite the command performance invitation. Paula Kane was 62 and fought every year of it with hair dye and expensive creams that she charged to the company credit card under business expenses. "Hi, Mom." Julian kissed her cheek dutifully, inhaling the cloud of perfume that always reminded him of church and disappointment. Francine emerged from the kitchen carrying a casserole dish, Winston trotting behind her like a furry shadow. "Oh good, you made it. I was telling Mom about Winston's new trainer. Did you know dogs can learn to paint? He's already showing real artistic potential." Julian bit back his first 3 responses and settled for, "That's great, Francine." Sean was conspicuously absent, though his place was set at the table. This wasn't unusual. Sean operated on what he called creative time, which typically meant showing up whenever he felt like it. "Where's Sean?" Julian asked as they gathered around the table. "He's running a little late," Paula said, serving portions with the precision of a surgeon. "He's been so busy with his new venture. Did I tell you he's starting a consulting business?" Julian caught Sophia's eye across the table. She was picking at her food, her attention focused on her phone. "What kind of consulting?" "Life optimization," Paula said proudly. "He's going to help people unlock their full potential." "For a fee, I assume," Julian said. "Of course for a fee," Francine interjected. "Expertise has value. Not everyone can just swing a hammer for a living." The comment hung in the air like smoke. Julian set down his fork slowly, the way he did when he was calculating the load-bearing capacity of a structure before it collapsed. "That hammer swinging pays for a lot around here," he said quietly. "Julian," Sophia said, her voice carrying a warning that he'd heard more frequently lately. "Let it go." But Julian was tired of letting things go. Tired of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who cleaned up everyone else's messes while they mocked his methods. "Actually, I think we should talk about it," Julian said. "Since we're all here." Sean chose that moment to burst through the front door, bringing with him the energy of someone who'd never met a responsibility he couldn't postpone. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was insane." At 7 p.m. on a Sunday in Cedar Rapids, traffic was about as insane as a church bake sale, but no one challenged the lie. They never challenged Sean's lies. "I was just telling Julian about your consulting business," Paula said, immediately shifting her attention to her youngest son. "Oh man, it's going to be huge," Sean said, loading his plate with enthusiasm that Julian wished he'd show for actual work. "I've got this whole system worked out. It's like life coaching, but deeper, more holistic." "What are your qualifications?" Julian asked. Sean laughed, the kind of laugh that suggested Julian was missing something obvious. "Experienced brother. I've lived through failure, learned from it, and now I can help others avoid the same mistakes. By charging the money for advice you couldn't follow yourself." The table went quiet. Even Winston seemed to sense the tension, slinking over to lie down by Francine's feet. "Julian," Paula said, her voice sharp with disapproval, "your brother is trying to better himself. With whose money? That's enough." Sophia's voice cut through the room like a blade. "We should be supporting each other, not tearing each other down." Julian looked at his wife, really looked at her. The new diamond earrings that he hadn't bought. The designer handbag that cost more than most people's rent. The way she was defending his family against him, as if he was the problem. "You're right," Julian said, standing up. "We should support each other. That's what families do." He walked to the window, looking out at the street where he'd grown up, where he'd learned that being dependable made you invisible and being generous made you a target. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," he continued. "About what family means. About loyalty. About who you can really count on when everything falls apart." When he turned back to the table, 5 pairs of eyes were watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance. Only Sophia looked worried, and that worried him most of all. "What's that supposed to mean?" Francine asked. Julian smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed all evening. "It means my birthday's coming up, and I'm planning something special." Chapter 3. The Birthday Revelation. 3 weeks later, Julian woke up on his 30th birthday to an empty house and a single text message from Sophia. "At the gym early. Happy birthday. Dinner tonight." He stared at the message for a long moment, noting what wasn't there. No kiss goodbye, no card on the nightstand, No acknowledgement that this was supposed to be a milestone. Just a question mark that somehow made dinner sound like an inconvenience rather than a celebration. Julian made coffee in the kitchen of the house he'd bought with his own money, paid for with his own labor, and felt the familiar weight of solitude that had become his most constant companion. He'd taken the day off work, the first personal day he'd taken in 8 months, and the silence stretched around him like an accusation. His phone remained stubbornly quiet throughout the morning. No calls from his mother, no texts from his siblings, no acknowledgement from anyone in his family that this day meant anything at all. By noon, Julian had received exactly 3 birthday messages. One from his foreman at the construction site, one from his accountant, and one from the auto shop reminding him his inspection was due. That was when he decided to check social media. Julian rarely used Instagram. It was Sophia's domain, full of carefully curated images of their life that bore little resemblance to reality. But something made him open the app, scroll through the endless parade of other people's happiness, and then he saw it. A photo posted by his sister Francine, time-stamped an hour ago. The location, Riverside Event Center, one of the most expensive venues in the city. The image, his entire family gathered around an elaborately decorated table, party hats on their heads, celebrating with champagne and cake. The guest of honor wasn't human. Winston the golden retriever sat in a custom high chair, wearing a bow tie and a birthday crown, surrounded by presents wrapped in gold paper. The cake in front of him was shaped like a bone and probably cost more than Julian spent on groceries in a month. The caption made his blood freeze. The only one who deserves celebration. Our precious Winston turns 3 today. Hashtag best boy ever, hashtag family first, hashtag love him. Julian stared at the photo, cataloging every detail with the methodical precision he used for structural inspections. His mother, beaming with more joy than he'd seen from her in years. Sean, actually dressed up for once, raising a champagne flute in a toast. Francine and Taylor, looking like the perfect couple celebrating their perfect dog's perfect day. And Sophia, his wife, wearing the dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, laughing at something Sean was saying, holding a glass of champagne like she belonged there. Like she was part of a family that had deliberately excluded her own husband on his birthday to celebrate a dog. Julian's hands were surprisingly steady as he typed a comment. Nice venue. The response came within minutes from his mother's account. That dog is worth more than you. The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were surprising, but because they were true. Not financially, Julian knew his net worth down to the penny, but emotionally. To his family, Winston the dog was worth more love, more attention, more celebration than Julian had ever received. Julian typed his response carefully. Enjoy it while you can. Then he put his phone down and made one call, followed by 3 carefully crafted text messages that would change everything. The call was to Roberto Vaughn, a private investigator Julian had hired 2 months ago when his suspicions about Sophia became impossible to ignore. Roberto's report was due tomorrow, but Julian moved up the timeline. I need everything you have. Tonight. Julian, are you sure? Maybe you should wait until tonight. The first text went to his lawyer, Neil Moore, a man who specialized in asset protection and understood that sometimes the best defense was a devastating offense. The second text went to his accountant, requesting an emergency audit of all accounts connected to Kane and Sons Construction. The third text went to someone his family had never heard of, someone who had been waiting patiently for Julian to make a decision he'd been avoiding for months. As the sun set on his 30th birthday, Julian sat in his empty house and opened Roberto's report. The photographs were crisp and clear. Sophia entering and leaving a downtown hotel with Ernest Thayer, the city's deputy planning commissioner. The same Ernest Thayer who had the power to approve or deny the construction permits that kept Julian's business running. The timestamps told a story Julian had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Lunch meetings that ran past dinner. Hotel visits that coincided with Sophia's gym sessions. Business dinners where Julian wasn't invited, but his wife somehow was. The final photograph showed Sophia and Ernest in what was clearly a hotel room, and Julian closed the folder without looking further. He'd seen enough. 2 weeks later, His phone rang at 6 in the morning. Francine's name flashed on the screen, and Julian let it go to voicemail before calling her back. "You can't do that, TOUS," she screamed before he could say hello. "I'll sue you for $80,000 in damages." Julian leaned back in his chair at the construction office, watching the sunrise paint the sky the color of justice. "Good morning to you too, Francine," he said calmly. "What seems to be the problem?" Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The problem, as Francine saw it, was that Julian had somehow reached through the carefully constructed walls of her perfect life and torn everything down in a single night. "The venue is demanding payment," she shrieked into the phone. "They said the credit card was declined, and now they want the full amount plus penalties. $80,000, Julian." Julian sipped his coffee, savoring both the caffeine and the panic in his sister's voice. "That's unfortunate. What does that have to do with me? Don't play dumb. You canceled the company credit card without warning." "I didn't cancel it," Julian said truthfully. "I simply exercised my authority as CEO to review all business expenses." Seems Winston's birthday party was charged to Kane and Sons Construction as a business expense. The silence on the other end was deafening. It was a mistake," Francine stammered. "Taylor must have grabbed the wrong card for an $80,000 dog party." "What was the business purpose of that expense, Francine?" "You know what?" Francine's voice shifted from panic to rage. "You're being petty because we didn't invite you to a family gathering." "Grow up." "A family gathering," Julian repeated. "On my birthday." "Oh, please, like you care about birthdays. You never even show up for anything anyway." Julian set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "I show up for everything, Francine. Every Sunday dinner where you mock my work. Every holiday where Sean gets bailed out of his latest failure. Every crisis where Mom needs the reliable son to fix what the favorite son broke. That's not. I showed up when Dad died and someone needed to run the business. I showed up when Sean defaulted on his car loan and needed someone to co-sign the new one. I showed up when your precious Winston needed emergency surgery and your husband's consulting fees couldn't cover the vet bills." The silence stretched long enough for Julian to hear his sister's breathing change. "So let me ask you again," Julian continued, his voice deadly calm. "What was the business purpose of an $80,000 party that I wasn't invited to, charged to my company, to celebrate a dog's birthday on my birthday?" Julian, Francine's voice was smaller now, the fight draining out of it. "Mom planned it. She said you wouldn't mind. She said you never use the card anyway. Mom doesn't have authorization to use company funds. You know who does?" "Julian, please. We'll pay it back. It was just supposed to be a way to humiliate me while celebrating a dog with my money. I understand perfectly." Julian ended the call and immediately dialed Neil Moore. "Neil, I need you to file the paperwork we discussed today. Are you sure about this, Julian? Once we start down this path, they started us down this path. I'm just choosing the destination." The paperwork Neil filed that morning would restructure Kane and Sons Construction as a limited liability company with Julian as the sole owner and decision-maker. Every family member who had been drawing salary, benefits, or expenses from the company would need to reapply for their positions and justify their value to the organization. It was perfectly legal and devastatingly effective. But that was just the opening move. The real game was happening across town, where Sophia was about to discover that Julian's patience had limits that even her considerable charm couldn't exceed. Roberto Vaughn was waiting in the lobby of the downtown Marriott when Sophia arrived for her gym session at 2 p.m. He didn't approach her. That wasn't his job today. His job was to document every detail of what happened next. Ernest Thayer had no idea he was walking into a trap when he met Sophia in a hotel bar. He had no way of knowing that Julian had spent weeks learning everything about Ernest's life. His marriage to Bernadette Thayer, his teenage daughter who attended private school, his aspirations for higher office, and most importantly, his complete dependence on maintaining a spotless public reputation. What Ernest also didn't know was that Julian had already met with 3 members of the City Planning Commission over the past month, sharing concerns about potential conflicts of interest in the permit approval process. Nothing specific, of course, Just general observations about the importance of transparency in city government. By 3 p.m., when Sophia and Ernest moved their meeting to room 412, Roberto had photographed every moment of their arrival. But more importantly, he photographed the envelope Julian had asked him to deliver to the front desk an hour earlier. The envelope contained printed copies of every photograph Roberto had taken over the past 2 months, along with a note written in Julian's careful handwriting. Mr. Thayer, I believe these belong to your wife. I thought she should know where you've been spending your afternoons. J. Kane, the hotel manager, a woman named Caroline Delaney who owed Julian a favor from a construction project he'd completed under budget and ahead of schedule, personally delivered the envelope to room 412 at exactly 3:30 p.m. Roberto later told Julian that the shouting could be heard 3 rooms away. While Sophia's world was imploding at the Marriott, Julian was making his final move against his family. The meeting with his mother took place in the same dining room where she'd served pot roast and casual cruelty for 30 years. Julian, honey, what's this about? Paula asked, gesturing to the folder of documents Neil had prepared. Francine said something about the company, but I didn't understand. It's about accountability, Mom, Julian said, sitting in the same chair where he'd endured countless lectures about responsibility while watching his siblings avoid consequences for everything. It's about the fact that you spent $80,000 of company money on a dog's birthday party on my birthday. Paula's face went through several expressions before settling on the wounded innocence she'd perfected over the years. That was a mistake, sweetie. We got confused about the cards. No confusion. Francine used the company card because she knew I'd pay for it, just like I always do. Julian, you're being unreasonable. It's just money. It's my money, earned by my work, from a company I've been running for 3 years while you and Sean and Francine take draws like you're contributing something other than criticism. Julian slid the documents across the table. Effective immediately, Kane & Sons Construction is restructuring. All family members currently receiving compensation from the company will need to interview for their positions and demonstrate their value to the organization. Paula stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. You can't do this. Your father left the company to me, not to you, not to Sean, not to Francine, to me. But we're family. Julian stood up, feeling lighter than he had in years. Family doesn't charge $80,000 to humiliate each other. Family doesn't choose a dog over their son on his birthday. Family doesn't take and take and take while calling the person paying for everything worthless. Julian, please. The interviews are next week. Neil has the details. Julian walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Mom, send me Winston's veterinary records. If he's going to be treated like family, he can get his own health insurance instead of billing it to my company as a business expense. The drive home took Julian past the Marriott, where he could see Roberto's car still in the parking lot. Sophia's car was gone, but Ernest's BMW remained, which suggested the afternoon had gone exactly as Julian had planned. His phone was already buzzing with increasingly frantic calls and texts from his family, but Julian didn't answer. He had one more stop to make before his transformation was complete. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. Clayton Sanders' law office occupied the top floor of a downtown building that Julian's company had renovated 2 years earlier. Clayton specialized in family law, but his real expertise was in making problems disappear quietly and permanently. Julian, Clayton said, rising from behind a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. Right on time. Julian had been planning this meeting for 6 months, ever since he'd realized that his marriage was a performance and his family was a business expense he could no longer afford. Do you have everything? Julian asked. Clayton opened a file thick enough to choke a horse. Divorce papers, asset protection agreements, restructuring documents for the business, and a few surprises that should keep everyone very cooperative. The prenup? Ironclad. Sophia gets exactly what she brought to the marriage, which according to our audit was approximately $14,000 in credit card debt and a leased Honda Civic. Julia nodded. Sophia had been smart about hiding her affair, but she'd been sloppy about everything else. The designer clothes, expensive dinners, and weekend trips she'd been taking were all paid for with joint credit cards and bank accounts that Julian could trace to the penny. What about Ernest? Clayton smiled the way sharks smile when they smell blood. Deputy Planning Commissioner Thayer has some very interesting financial records. Seems he's been approving permits for developments where his wife's real estate company was the listing agent. Technically legal, but ethically questionable. How questionable? Questionable enough that the mayor would be very interested in avoiding any scandals before the next election. Questionable enough that Mrs. Thayer might be very motivated to keep her husband away from other people's wives. Julian's phone buzzed again. Sophia, calling for the 7th time in the past hour. This time, he answered. "Where are you?" Her voice was ragged, desperate in a way he'd never heard before. "At Clayton Sanders' office," Julian said calmly. "We've been having a very productive conversation about asset division and marital misconduct." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Julian, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. You always were good with explanations." "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. The question is what you're going to do about it." Julian could hear her breathing change, could picture her in their kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that she'd insisted they couldn't afford but somehow managed to buy anyway. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you gone. Tonight. Take what you brought to this marriage and leave everything else." "Julian, please. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Multiple choices over multiple months with multiple lies to cover them up. Now I'm making a choice. Where am I supposed to go?" Julian looked at Clayton, who was making notes with the enthusiasm of a man billing by the hour. "I'm sure Ernest has some suggestions. After all, you've been spending so much time discussing real estate together." "We can't," his wife found out. "She's filing for divorce. He's not returning my calls." The satisfaction Julian felt was clean and sharp, like the feeling of a perfectly measured cut. "That's unfortunate. Maybe you should have considered the consequences before you decided to use my marriage as cover for your real estate ventures." "Julian, I love you." "No, Sophia. You love what I could provide. There's a difference." He ended the call and looked at Clayton. "How long before this is final? In Iowa? With a prenup this solid and evidence of adultery? 6 months if she fights it. 3 if she's smart enough to sign everything. Make sure she understands the benefits of being smart." Julian left Clayton's office feeling like he'd shed a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The sun was setting as he drove home, painting the sky the color of endings and beginnings. His house felt different when he walked through the door. Sophia's things were gone. Her clothes, her makeup, her collection of real estate awards that he'd never understood the point of. She'd left behind the furniture they'd bought together, the appliances he'd paid for, and a note on the kitchen counter written in her careful handwriting. "I never meant for it to happen this way. I'm sorry." Julian crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. Apologies were just words, and words were cheap. Actions had consequences, and consequences were expensive. His phone rang again, this time showing Sean's name. Julian let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message while opening a beer from a refrigerator that was finally his again. "Dude, what the hell is going on? Mom's crying, Francine's threatening to sue you, and Sophia showed up at my apartment saying you kicked her out? Call me back. We need to talk." Julian deleted the message without responding. He was done talking to people who only wanted to communicate when they needed something from him. But the evening wasn't over. At precisely 8 p.m., his doorbell rang. Julian opened it to find Ernest Thayer standing on his porch, looking like a man who'd spent the day discovering exactly how much his life was worth to the people he'd thought he could trust. "We need to talk," Ernest said. "No," Julian replied, starting to close the door. "Please." The word came out like Ernest was choking on it. 5 minutes. Julian studied the man who'd been sleeping with his wife, who'd been using his marriage as a cover for an affair that could have destroyed both their lives. Ernest looked older than his 42 years, with thinning hair and the soft build of a man who'd never done physical labor. He was exactly the kind of man Julian had expected Sophia to choose, safe, connected, and completely lacking in the backbone required to build something lasting. 5 minutes, Julian said, stepping aside. Ernest entered the living room like he was walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. I want you to know I never meant for it to happen. Funny, Julian said. Sophia said the same thing. It just developed. We were working on the permit applications for your projects, and she was handling the real estate side, and we started meeting to coordinate. And you decided to coordinate in hotel rooms. Ernest flinched. I know how it looks. It looks like you were using your position on the planning commission to expedite permits for developments where my wife was the listing agent, while sleeping with her on the side. It wasn't like that. Julian sat down in his recliner, the one piece of furniture in the house that was truly his. What was it like, Ernest? I love her. The words hung in the air like a confession. Julian found himself almost impressed by Ernest's honesty, even if his timing was catastrophically bad. Then why are you here instead of with her? Ernest's face crumpled. My wife filed for divorce this afternoon. She's taking the kids to her mother's house. My boss called me into his office and suggested I take a leave of absence while the ethics committee reviews my conduct. And Sophia won't return my calls, so she needs time to think. Julian nodded slowly. So you've lost your wife, your kids, probably your job, and the woman you claim to love won't talk to you. And you're here because I want to know what you want from me. Nothing, Julian said simply. I don't want anything from you, Ernest. You've already given me everything I needed. I don't understand. You've proven that my wife was exactly who I thought she was. You've demonstrated that the people I trusted were worth exactly what I always suspected. And you've shown me that sometimes the best thing you can do is let people make their own choices and live with the consequences. Ernest stared at him with the expression of a man who'd expected anger and found something much worse, indifference. What about the permits? The project we were working on? Julian smiled, and Ernest took an involuntary step backward. Those projects will proceed based on their merits, not on whether the deputy planning commissioner was sleeping with my wife. I believe in doing business the right way, Ernest. Always have. Then why? Why did I expose your affair? Because I believe in transparency. Because I think your wife deserved to know where you were spending your afternoons. Because I think the people of this city deserve public officials who can keep their personal lives from interfering with their professional duties. Julian stood up, and Ernest backed toward the door. And because Julian continued, I believe that people should face the consequences of their choices. You chose to have an affair with a married woman. Sophia chose to betray her marriage vows. My family chose to humiliate me with my own money on my birthday. Everyone made their choices. What about your choices? Julian opened the front door. I chose to stop pretending that loyalty was something other people owed me instead of something I could demand through consequences. After Ernest left, Julian sat in his quiet house and made a list of everything he needed to do in the coming weeks. The divorce proceedings would be straightforward. The business restructuring would eliminate the financial deadweight his family had become. The house would be his alone, decorated according to his preferences instead of Sophia's expensive taste. For the first time in years, Julian Kane felt like the master of his own life. But he wasn't done yet. Chapter 6, The Fallout. The interviews began the following Monday at exactly 9 a.m. in the conference room of Kane & Sons Construction. Julian had arranged the schedule alphabetically, which meant his mother was first. Paula Kane entered the room like she was attending a funeral, dressed in the black suit she reserved for the most serious occasions. She sat across from Julian and Neil Moore with the air of someone who'd been gravely wronged by the universe. This is ridiculous, she said before anyone could speak. I'm your mother, and I'm the CEO of this company, Julian replied, consulting the notes Neil had prepared. Let's start with your current position. Can you describe your role at Kane & Sons? I don't have a role. I have a relationship. I'm family. Neil made a note on his legal pad. For tax purposes, Mrs. Kane has been receiving a salary of $60,000 annually as Community Relations Coordinator, plus benefits. What duties does that position entail? Julian asked. Paula shifted uncomfortably. I represent the company at community events. Church functions, charity dinners, that sort of thing. Can you provide documentation of these activities? Calendars, reports, outcomes? I don't write reports, Julian. I build relationships. With who specifically? The interview continued for 20 minutes, during which Paula was unable to identify a single concrete business outcome from her community relations efforts. She couldn't name any contracts that resulted from her networking, any referrals she generated, or any measurable benefit to the company's reputation. "I see," Julian said when she'd finished. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." "That's it." Paula's voice cracked slightly. "You're not even going to—" "The position of community relations coordinator is being eliminated," Julian said. "However, there's an opening for a part-time administrative assistant. 15 hours a week, $20 an hour, no benefits. You're welcome to apply." Paula stared at him like he'd spoken in ancient Greek. Administrative assistant, filing, answering phones, basic clerical work. The position reports to Mrs. Rita Chambers, our office manager. "You wanted to answer phones? I want you to contribute value to this company proportional to what you take from it. Whether that's answering phones or finding another job is your choice." Paula left without another word, and Julian could hear her crying in the parking lot through the conference room window. Francine's interview was scheduled for 10 a.m., but she arrived 30 minutes late with Taylor in tow for moral support. "I assume you're here to apologize," she said, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. "I'm here to conduct an employment interview," Julian replied. "Taylor, this is a private meeting." "He's staying," Francine said. "I want a witness." Julian looked at Neil, who shrugged. "It's your company." "Fine." "Francine, can you describe your current position with Kane & Sons?" "I'm the marketing director." "And your salary?" "$45,000, plus benefits and expenses." "Can you show me examples of marketing materials you've created?" Francine opened her mouth, then closed it. "I work more on strategy than execution." "What strategies have you implemented?" "Well, I suggested we should advertise in the church bulletin." "Did we?" "No. You said it was too expensive." Julian made a note. "What else?" For the next 15 minutes, Francine described a series of marketing ideas that had never been implemented, strategies that had never been developed, and campaigns that existed only in her imagination. Her greatest accomplishment appeared to be designing business cards that were never printed. "I see," Julian said finally. "The marketing director position is being eliminated. You can't fire family. I'm not firing you. I'm eliminating a position that serves no function. However, there's an opening for a sales associate. Commission-based, no base salary. You'll be responsible for generating new business through cold calls and referrals." Francine looked like Julian had suggested she take up snake charming. "Sales? I don't do sales." "Then I guess you don't work here." "This is because of the party," she said, her voice rising. "You're punishing us because of one mistake." "I'm eliminating positions that don't generate value," Julian said calmly. "If you believe your marketing efforts have value, I'm sure other companies will be happy to hire you." Francine stormed out, dragging Taylor behind her like a piece of luggage. Sean's interview was scheduled for 2 p.m., but he didn't show up. At 2:30, Julian's phone buzzed with a text. "This is BS. I'll start my own company." Julian showed the message to Neil, who smiled. "I think that takes care of the business development consultant position." "What business development consultant position?" "The one that was paying your brother $35,000 a year to think about maybe developing business someday." Julian leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of years of family obligation lifting from his shoulders. "Send termination letters to all 3 of them. Final paychecks, COBRA information, the works." "What about severance?" "Family doesn't get severance," Julian said. "They get exactly what they've earned." That evening, Julian came home to find 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages. He scrolled through them while eating takeout Chinese food in his blessedly quiet kitchen. From his mother, "How could you do this to your own family?" From Francine, "You're going to regret this when you need us." From Sean, "You always were a selfish bastard." From various aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd heard partial versions of the story. Everything from concerned inquiries to direct accusations. Julian deleted them all without responding. The knock on his door came at 8 p.m. This time, it was Roberto Vaughn, holding a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man with interesting news. Thought you should see this, Roberto said, handing over the envelope. Taken this afternoon. The photograph showed Sophia loading suitcases into a car Julian didn't recognize, a red Mustang convertible that probably cost more than most people made in a year. The driver was a man Julian had never seen before, mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't buy his way out of. Who is he? Julian asked. Max Booker. Owns 3 car dealerships and a chain of restaurants. Recently divorced, worth about $12 million. Julian studied the photographs. Sophia was laughing at something Max was saying, her hand on his arm in a gesture Julian remembered from their own early dates. She moved on with impressive speed. How long? Julian asked. Best I can tell, about 2 weeks. He filed for divorce a month ago, around the same time your wife started her gym membership. So she was hedging her bets. Smart woman, Roberto said. If the thing with Ernest hadn't blown up, she could have kept both relationships going indefinitely. Julian set the photographs on his kitchen counter next to the takeout containers. Send copies to Clayton. He'll want them for the divorce proceedings. You okay? Roberto asked. Julian considered the question. His wife was gone. His family had disowned him. His business was leaner but more profitable. His house was quiet but peaceful. I'm perfect, he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Chapter 7. The Reconstruction. 6 weeks after the birthday that changed everything, Julian Kane walked through the offices of Kane and Sons Construction and felt like he was seeing the place for the first time. Without the constant drain of unnecessary salaries and manufacturer crises, the company was running more efficiently than it had in years. Rita Chambers had been promoted to operations manager, a position that came with real authority and a significant raise. She'd hired 2 new administrative assistants, actual qualified candidates instead of relatives, and implemented systems that made the daily operations run like clockwork. The construction crews were happier too. Without the constant pressure to fund family expenses disguised as business costs, Julian had been able to improve working conditions, upgrade equipment, and offer performance bonuses that actually rewarded productivity. Morning, boss, called out Brad Maynard, the foreman on the Morrison project. We're 3 days ahead of schedule and under budget. Julian nodded, unsurprised. The Morrison project was the same one he'd been working on the morning Francine called about the venue charges. Without the distraction of family drama and financial manipulation, his focus had returned to what he did best, building things that lasted. His phone buzzed with a text from Clayton Sanders. Divorce hearing scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Sophia's attorney is pushing for spousal support. We need to talk. Julian pocketed the phone and headed to his office, where he found an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby. Alberta George was in her 70s, impeccably dressed, and had the bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of personality. Mr. Kane? I'm Alberta George. I believe we have some mutual acquaintances. Julian shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. We haven't, but I know your family quite well. Your mother and I attend the same church. Your sister and I served on the hospital charity board together. Julian gestured toward his office. Please come in. Can I get you coffee? That's very kind. Alberta settled into the chair across from his desk with the grace of someone who'd been conducting business meetings since before Julian was born. I'll be direct, Mr. Kane. I'm here about the Riverside Event Center situation. Julian kept his expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. The $80,000 bill your sister can't pay. The venue has contacted me about purchasing the debt. And you're interested because... Alberta smiled, and Julian understood why she'd been successful in business for 5 decades. Because I believe in consequences, Mr. Kane. Your sister used that venue for a party designed to humiliate you, charged it to your company without authorization, and now expects someone else to clean up the mess. Where you propose, I purchased the debt for 60 cents on the dollar. Francine owes me $48,000 instead of $80,000. I collect through garnishment of her husband's wages until it's paid in full, with interest. Julian leaned back in his chair. Why would you do that? Because your sister has been telling people that you're the villain in this story. Poor Francine, victimized by her cruel brother who doesn't understand family loyalty. Alberta's smile sharpened. I thought she should learn what real financial pressure feels like. And what do you want from me? Nothing. This is a gift. Consider it a welcome to the club. What club? People who refuse to be taken advantage of by family members who confuse love with unlimited financial resources. After Alberta left, Julian sat in his office thinking about the concept of justice. For 30 years, he believed that being the responsible one meant absorbing the consequences of everyone else's choices. He thought that family meant accepting disrespect in exchange for belonging. But Alberta George had shown him a different perspective. Sometimes justice wasn't about punishment. It was about allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their decisions without interference. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Clayton Sanders' name appeared on the screen. Julian, we have a problem. Sophia's attorney is claiming emotional distress and financial hardship. They're asking for $50,000 in temporary spousal support while the divorce is pending. On what grounds? They're arguing that your actions, exposing the affair, freezing accounts, forcing her to leave the house, constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress. Julian laughed, a sound that had more in common with a chainsaw than humor. She's claiming emotional distress because I documented her affair and protected my assets. They're also claiming she can't work because the scandal has damaged her reputation in real estate. Interesting theory. What's your recommendation? Fight it. We have documentation that she was planning to leave the marriage anyway. The relationship with Max Booker proves she was looking for an exit strategy. But Julian, I have to ask, are you prepared for this to get uglier? Julian looked out his office window at the construction site where his crews were building something solid and permanent. Clayton, I've spent 30 years watching my family take everything I built and use it against me. I'm done being cooperative. What does that mean? It means we don't just fight the spousal support claim. We go on offense. That afternoon, Julian made 3 phone calls that would change the trajectory of the divorce proceedings. The first call was to the Iowa Department of Revenue. Julian reported suspected tax fraud related to unreported income from real estate commissions. If Sophia had been hiding assets during their marriage, the state would be very interested in collecting back taxes and penalties. The second call was to Ernest Thayer's Ethics Committee. Julian provided detailed documentation about the timing of permit approvals relative to Sophia's real estate commissions. While technically legal, the appearance of impropriety would ensure Ernest's career in public service was over. The third call was to Max Booker's ex-wife, a woman named Constance Booker who, according to Roberto's research, was still fighting for asset disclosure in her own divorce proceedings. Mrs. Booker, this is Julian Kane. I believe we have a mutual interest in ensuring that Max's financial disclosures are complete and accurate. The conversation that followed was illuminating. Constance Booker had suspected her husband of hiding assets for months, but she hadn't been able to prove it. Julian's photographs of Sophia with Max, combined with the timeline of their relationship, suggested that Max had been planning his exit from his marriage longer than his financial disclosures indicated. If you're willing to share those photographs, Constance said, my attorney can subpoena Max's financial record for the period when he was seeing your wife. If he was spending money on her while claiming poverty in our divorce proceedings, he could face perjury charges, Julian finished, and substantial penalties. Plus, any assets he transferred or concealed would be subject to recovery. Julian agreed to share the photographs, not out of vindictiveness, but out of principle. If Max wanted to play in multiple divorce proceedings simultaneously, he should face the consequences of his choices. By the end of the week, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Sophia's request for spousal support was withdrawn when her attorney learned about the tax investigation. Ernest Thayer submitted his resignation from the Planning Commission. Max Booker's divorce proceedings were reopened with new evidence of financial misconduct. Julian received one final call from his mother on Friday evening. Julian, please. We're family. Can't we work this out? Mom, Julian said, standing in his kitchen that no longer echoed with other people's problems. We're family. That's exactly why this needed to happen. I don't understand. Family means holding each other accountable. Family means not using love as an excuse for disrespect. Family means contributing instead of just taking. But we love you. No, Mom. You love what I could provide. There's a difference. Julian ended the call and looked around his house. Truly his house now, free of obligations to people who had confused his reliability with weakness. The transformation was complete, but the story wasn't over. Chapter 8. The New Foundation. 3 months later, Julian stood in the boardroom of what was now officially Kane Construction LLC, looking at quarterly reports that told the story of a company reborn. Without the financial burden of supporting unproductive family members, the business had grown by 30%. They'd hired 6 new employees, all based on merit rather than genetics, and had won contracts for 2 major commercial projects. Not bad for a company that was supposedly destroyed by family infighting, said Rita Chambers, reviewing the financial statements with obvious satisfaction. Julian smiled. The rumors had been spectacular. Depending on who was telling the story, Julian had either driven his family into poverty through greed, lost his mind over a failed marriage, or was heading for bankruptcy after alienating all his connections. None of the stories were true, but Julian had stopped caring about public opinion around the same time he'd stopped caring about family approval. "How's the Morrison development coming?" he asked. "Finished 2 weeks early and 15% under budget. The buyer is so happy they've referred us to 3 other projects." Julian nodded, unsurprised. Quality work had a way of speaking for itself, unlike family connections which mostly just made noise. His phone buzzed with a message from Clayton Sanders. Divorce finalized. Sophia gets exactly what the prenup specified. You're officially free. Julian felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the end of his marriage and everything to do with the end of a chapter in his life where other people's choices had dictated his circumstances. The knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Roberto Vaughn entered, carrying a folder and wearing an expression that suggested he had news worth hearing. "Thought you'd want to know," Roberto said, settling into his usual chair. "Sophia's engagement to Max Booker has been called off." Oh, turns out Constance Booker's attorney was very thorough in reviewing Max's finances. They found about $2 million in assets he'd failed to disclose, plus evidence that he'd been supporting Sophia for months before either divorce was filed. Julian raised an eyebrow. Criminal charges? Perjury, contempt of court, and fraud. Max is looking at serious jail time and financial penalties that will probably cost him everything. And Sophia? Unemployed. The Real Estate Commission is investigating her relationship with Ernest Thayer. Turns out she'd been getting inside information about upcoming development projects and using it to target properties for her clients. Julian absorbed this information without satisfaction or schadenfreude. These were simply the natural consequences of choices other people had made. What about Ernest? Resigned from the Planning Commission, separated from his wife, working at a hardware store in Des Moines. His wife got the house, the kids, and most of his pension. Roberto closed the folder and studied Julian's face. Most people would feel something about all this. Victory, satisfaction, revenge, something. Julian considered this. "I feel relief," he said finally. "Relief that I'm no longer responsible for managing the consequences of other people's poor choices." "And your family? What about them?" "Sean's consulting business failed. He's back to living with your mother. Francine and Taylor are struggling with the debt payments to Alberta George. Your mother had to sell the house and move into a retirement community." Julian felt a brief flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it passed quickly. "They're adults, Roberto. They made their choices. And you don't feel any obligation to help?" Julian stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the construction site where his crew was laying the foundation for a new office building. The work was precise, methodical, built to last. "I spent 30 years helping," he said. "I covered their debts, cleaned up their messes, and absorbed their disrespect. And what did I get for it? A birthday party for a dog charged to my company while they called me worthless." Roberto nodded slowly. "So what's next?" "Next, I build something better. A company based on merit instead of obligation. Relationships based on mutual respect instead of financial dependence. A life where my generosity is a choice instead of an expectation. After Roberto left, Julian sat alone in his office and made a list of the changes in his life since that February birthday. Divorced from a wife who had been using their marriage as cover for multiple affairs. Free from family members who treated his success as their inheritance. Running a more profitable business with better employees. Living in a house that reflected his preferences instead of other people's demands. Sleeping better than he had in years. The list looked like a balance sheet, and the numbers were decidedly in his favor. His phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. Julian Kane. Mr. Kane? This is Deborah Ackerman from the Chamber of Commerce. I'm calling about the Contractor of the Year award. The committee would like to schedule a presentation ceremony. Julian paused. He'd submitted his company for consideration 6 months ago, back when he was still trying to prove himself worthy of recognition from people whose opinions he valued. Now the award felt like acknowledgement of something he already knew, that he was good at what he did, regardless of what anyone else thought. That's very kind, Julian said. When were you thinking? Next month. We'd like to feature Kane Construction in our annual publication, and we're hoping you'd be willing to speak at our spring dinner about business resilience and family enterprises. Julian almost laughed at the irony. I'd be honored. After hanging up, Julian realized that the old Julian would have called his family to share the news, would have invited them to the ceremony, would have tried to use his success to bridge the gaps they'd created. The new Julian simply made a note on his calendar and moved on to the next item on his agenda. But the day wasn't over. At 6 p.m., as Julian was preparing to leave the office, he received one final visitor that would remind him why he'd made the choices he'd made. Sophia Kane, soon to be Sophia Charles again, stood in his lobby looking like a woman who'd lost a war she hadn't realized she was fighting. Chapter 9. The Final Reckoning. Sophia looked smaller than Julian remembered, as if the weight of consequences had compressed her into a more compact version of herself. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a sweater that looked like they came from a department store rather than a boutique. Her hair was shorter, less styled, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the exhaustion around her eyes. Julian, she said, her voice carrying none of the confidence he remembered. Thank you for seeing me. Julian gestured toward his office, noting how she hesitated before taking the chair across from his desk. The same chair where she used to sit when she visited him at work, back when she'd been interested in his success instead of threatened by it. What can I do for you, Sophia? She stared at her hands for a long moment before looking up. I wanted to apologize. For everything. Julian waited, curious to see where this conversation would lead. I know you probably don't want to hear this, she continued, but I need to say it. I was wrong. About the affair, about using our marriage as cover, about taking advantage of your trust. I was wrong about all of it. Okay, Julian said simply. I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying the woman he'd once loved enough to marry. What do you understand, Sophia? That you were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed it for something that was never real. Her voice cracked slightly. Ernest was using me to get information about development projects. Max was using me to hide assets from his wife. They never cared about me. They cared about what I could do for them. And what could you do for them? For Ernest? I was his cover story and his source of inside information about real estate values. For Max? I was his alibi and his emotional validation while he hid money from his divorce proceedings. Julian nodded. So they treated you the way you treated me. Sophia flinched as if he'd slapped her. Yes. And now that it's backfired, you want what? Sympathy? Understanding? Reconciliation? I want you to know that I realize what I lost. That I know you were faithful and generous and patient. And I repaid that by betraying everything you believed about our marriage. Julian stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Sophia's old BMW used to sit. Now there was a practical Honda Civic that probably belonged to one of his new employees. Sophia, he said without turning around, what you're describing isn't love. It's regret. What's the difference? Love would have prevented you from having the affair in the first place. Regret is what you feel when the consequences catch up with you. Julian turned back to face her. If Ernest hadn't lost his job, if Max hadn't been exposed as a fraud, if your career hadn't been destroyed, would you be here apologizing? She started to answer, then stopped. The honesty in her eyes was probably the most genuine emotion she'd shown in their entire marriage. I don't know, she said finally. I do, Julian said. You'd still be with Max, living off his money while he committed fraud to avoid supporting his ex-wife. Or you'd be with someone else who could provide what you thought you needed. Julian, you're here because your other options ran out, not because you realized you loved me. Sophia's composure finally cracked, and tears started rolling down her cheeks. Please, I have nowhere else to go. I've lost everything. No, Julian said, his voice gentle but firm. You traded everything. For excitement, for financial security, for the fantasy that someone else could give you a better life than the one you had. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? Julian sat back down, looking at this woman who had shared his bed, his home, his dreams, and his bank account while planning her exit strategy. Forgiveness isn't the issue, Sophia. Trust is. And trust, once broken the way you broke it, doesn't get rebuilt. It gets replaced. With what? With clarity. With boundaries. With the understanding that some choices are permanent. Sophia wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box Julian kept on his desk. So there's no chance? No possibility that we could try again? Julian thought about this question seriously, as he did all important questions. He thought about the Instagram photo that had started his transformation, about the months of lies and deception, about the systematic way Sophia had manipulated their marriage to serve her interests. If I took you back, Julian said slowly, what would that teach you about consequences? What would it teach me about self-respect? What would it teach anyone who's watching this situation about the value of faithfulness and honesty? It would teach forgiveness, redemption, second chances. No, Julian said. It would teach that betrayal is temporary, but financial security is permanent. It would teach that apologies can erase actions. It would teach that consequences only apply to other people. Sophia stared at him for a long moment, and Julian could see her processing the finality in his voice. What am I supposed to do now, she asked. Build a new life based on who you actually are instead of who you think you can manipulate into supporting you. I don't know how to do that. Then learn. The same way I learned how to live without a family that treated me like an ATM. The same way I learned how to run a business without relatives who confused nepotism with competence. The same way I learned how to be happy in a house where no one was lying to me. Julian stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. Sophia, I genuinely hope you figure out how to build something real. But you're going to do it without me. She gathered her purse and walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. Do you ever think about what we could have had? If I hadn't, if things had been different? Julian considered the question. I think about what we did have. A marriage where one person was building a future while the other person was planning an escape route. I think that tells me everything I need to know about what we could have had. After Sophia left, Julian sat in his office as the sun set over Cedar Rapids, painting the sky the color of endings and beginnings. He thought about the journey from that February birthday to this moment. From humiliation to liberation, from obligation to choice, from being used to being respected. His phone buzzed with a text from Rita Chambers. Reservation confirmed for the contractor's dinner next month. Should I order flowers for the table? Julian smiled and typed back, yes. But nothing too fancy. We're celebrating work, not image. As he locked up the office and walked to his truck, Julian reflected on the lesson that had taken him 30 years to learn. That being loved and being useful were not the same thing. His family had found him useful. Sophia had found him useful. But none of them had loved him enough to value what he offered instead of just taking what he provided. The drive home took him past the house where he'd grown up, now occupied by strangers who probably had no idea about the drama that had unfolded there months earlier. He passed the hotel where Sophia and Ernest had conducted their affair, now just another building with no power to hurt him. When Julian pulled into his driveway, he felt the same sense of peace that had become his default state since removing the sources of chaos from his life. His house was quiet but not lonely organized but not obsessive, comfortable but not extravagant. He had dinner alone and enjoyed it. He watched television without interruption and appreciated it. He went to bed without worrying about other people's problems and slept soundly because of it. 6 months ago, Julian Kane had been a man whose generosity was taken for granted, whose success was treated as community property, and whose loyalty was repaid with betrayal. Tonight, he was a man who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the refusal to be taken advantage of. The transformation was complete. The birthday that had shown him exactly how little his family valued him had become the catalyst for building a life where his value was never questioned, because he no longer gave anyone the opportunity to question it. Julian Kane slept the sleep of a man who had learned that happiness wasn't about being loved by people who didn't respect you. It was about respecting yourself enough to only accept love that came with respect attached. In the morning, he would wake up and continue building things that lasted. Buildings, businesses, relationships, and a life based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, Julian Kane went to sleep knowing that tomorrow belonged entirely to him. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.